The verse you've quoted 1,000 times, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," was not in any Bible for 400 years after Jesus died, and every pastor who went to seminary knows that. They just never told you. The first time I used that verse in an argument, I was in my early 40s. Someone at a Rotary Club lunch, a man I respected, a good man, we'd served on the same committee for 3 years, was making a case that the Old Testament God and the New Testament God were basically the same thing. Demanding, exacting, capable of terrible anger. And I said very quietly, because that is how I prefer to make arguments, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." I had that verse the way some men carry a good knife. Clean, reliable, always there. Woman caught in adultery. Pharisees drag her to Jesus. They quote the law, Leviticus, Deuteronomy. Moses says stone her. And what do you say? Jesus crouches down, writes something in the dust with his finger, and then stands and speaks 7 words that landed on the legal scholars of first-century Jerusalem like a verdict from a court none of them had anticipated. Let him without sin cast the first stone. One by one, starting with the oldest, they drop their rocks and walk away. Jesus is left alone with the woman. He straightens up. "Where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?" She says, "No one." He says, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." I believed for the better part of 5 decades that this passage was the single most precise demonstration of what separated Jesus from every religious authority who had come before him. Not demanding, not a stone thrower. Merciful in a way the law itself, the law he had been raised on, the law he knew letter by letter, could not be. I used that verse in arguments, in church hallways, at dinner tables. In a letter I once wrote to the editor of the local paper about something I will not get into here. That verse was mine. It was Howard's armor. Now here is the thing. It was not in any Bible for 400 years after Jesus died. I am not talking about a fringe claim. I'm not talking about something I found in a forum on the internet at 2 in the morning. What I'm about to show you is printed in double brackets right there on the page in the standard critical Greek text of the New Testament, published by the United Bible Societies. The same text used in first-year Greek courses at every major seminary on every continent. The scholars who compiled that text examined every surviving manuscript of the Gospel of John. They voted unanimously. Their conclusion is right there on the page, available to every pastor who ever went to seminary, every minister who ever stood behind a pulpit, every person in a collar who has ever quoted those 7 words to a congregation. The story of the woman caught in adultery, John chapter 7 verse 53 through chapter 8 verse 11, is not original to the Gospel of John. It was inserted, centuries later, by an anonymous hand, into a gospel that originally said something else in that space. The committee was unanimous, the brackets are in the book, and the sermon series continued without mentioning it. Stay with me. Because what Spinoza would have found in those manuscripts, what the passage that was actually there in the original reveals about the shape of John's argument, is genuinely surprising. And it does not go in the direction you might expect. The oldest manuscripts we possess of the Gospel of John do not contain this story. I want to be precise about what I mean by oldest, not early in some vague general sense. P66, a papyrus manuscript of John's Gospel that scholars date to somewhere between 175 and 225 CE, meaning it was physically written within roughly 150 years of the events it describes, does not contain the pericope Adultery. That is the Latin scholarly name for the passage, the pericope Adultery, the story of the adulteress. P66 goes from John chapter 7 verse 52 directly to John chapter 8 verse 12 without interruption. No woman, no stones, no Pharisees in the temple court, no morning gathering, nothing. P75, another papyrus often dated even earlier, late 2nd century into the early 3rd, one of the most carefully transcribed ancient manuscripts in existence, the text scholars trust most for reconstructing the early form of Luke and John. Same result. John chapter 7 verse 52. Then immediately without break, John chapter 8 verse 12. The story is not there. The Codex Sinaiticus, 4th century. the oldest complete New Testament that has survived. It is in the British Library in London, and you can read it page by page in the original Greek at codexsinaiticus.org right now. Open it to the Gospel of John, find chapter 7, read to verse 52, John chapter 8 verse 12. No break, no insertion. I am the light of the world, the Codex Vaticanus. Also 4th century, held in the Vatican. Same result. The passage is absent. And then there is the Codex Alexandrinus, 5th century, slightly later than the Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. The pages that would contain this exact section of John are missing, damaged or lost somewhere in the manuscript's long history. You cannot read them. But scholars measured what remains. Letters per line, lines per column, column dimensions. They ran the numbers. The missing pages do not have room for the pericope adultery. The spacing does not allow it. The passage was absent from Alexandrinus too, not readable as an absence but provable as one. 5 major witnesses, all of them arriving at the same conclusion. Absence is evidence. When the oldest, most carefully preserved manuscripts do not contain a passage, that absence means one thing. The passage was not in the exemplars those manuscripts were copied from. Whatever stream produced P66, P75, the Sinaiticus and the Vaticanus did not carry this story. It entered the tradition from a different direction, at a different time. The first Greek manuscript that contains the pericope adultery is the Codex Bezae, 5th century. A bilingual Greek-Latin manuscript from the Western tradition, the Latin-speaking churches of the Roman Empire, not the Alexandrian tradition that produced the Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. A different stream, a later stream. One that had been carrying this story in its Latin branch for at least 100 years before it appeared in Greek. The story came from the Latin West, not from the Greek East, not from the communities closest in language and geography to where Jesus lived and taught. But the manuscript history gets stranger, because even when the pericope adultery does start appearing, it does not appear in the same place. In the majority of manuscripts that contain it, the passage appears where we are used to seeing it, after John chapter 7 verse 52, interrupting the Jerusalem discourse. But in a small group of manuscripts, a handful scattered across different textual traditions, it appears somewhere else entirely, after John chapter 21 verse 25. At the very end of the gospel, after the last verse, tacked on like an afterthought, as though whoever inserted it could not decide where it belonged, and finally settled for appending it at the end. And then there are a few manuscripts on the Western tradition, a distinct group, where it appears not in John at all, but in the Gospel of Luke, after Luke chapter 21 verse 38. A different gospel, a different evangelist, a different narrative context entirely. Think about what that pattern means. A genuine passage that has been displaced from its original location has a characteristic signature. It travels with its neighbors. The surrounding verses come with it. The narrative flow moves around it. The textual disruption is local and traceable to a specific point of fracture. The pericope adultery has no original location. It migrates. It turns up in John in one section, in John in a different section, in Luke in a third section. Its movement through the manuscript tradition is the movement of a story that never had a fixed home in any written gospel, that circulated in oral tradition, passed from community to community, generation to generation, and was repeatedly inserted into whatever text someone had in front of them when they decided it was too good to leave out. The copyists who included it apparently sensed something was wrong. In a significant number of manuscripts that contain the passage, the scribes marked it with asterisks or obiloi, symbols used to flag text that was uncertain or suspected of being an intrusion. These were not modern critical scholars. These were the monks doing the copying, including what they received and simultaneously flagging it. The people who transmitted the story were questioning it at the same time. The brackets were always there, the tradition just stopped mentioning them. And then there is the linguistic evidence. When you analyze the vocabulary and grammatical constructions of John chapter 7 verse 53 through chapter 8 verse 11 against the rest of the Gospel of John, the Gospel these verses are supposed to be part of, you find a consistent mismatch. The word presbyteros, meaning elder, appears in verse 3 in a usage that does not occur anywhere else in John's Gospel. The phrase for being caught in the act uses constructions that Johannine scholars identify as foreign to John's style. Several idioms and transitional phrases in the passage have no parallel elsewhere in the entire Johannine corpus: the Gospel of John, the 3 letters of John, the Revelation. Ehrman's conclusion: the passage was composed in a community shaped by the Gospel of Luke, then inserted into John. Not deliberate forgery in the modern sense. More likely, a story that had been circulating orally was written down by someone whose Greek bore Luke's influence, and that version found its way into John's Gospel at some point in the copying chain. Genuine in spirit, composed by a different hand, placed into a Gospel that never originally contained it. Let me tell you how it got into the Latin Bible that shaped Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. The year is 383 CE. The Emperor Damasus, not Constantine, a different emperor 60 years later, has commissioned a scholar named Jerome to produce a standardized Latin translation of the scriptures. The Church by this point has dozens of Latin versions circulating, accumulated through generations of copying with all the inconsistencies and errors that copying produces, and the need for a uniform text has become pressing. Jerome was the most accomplished biblical linguist of the late 4th century. He read Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. He had access to major manuscript collections. He spent years in the desert outside Jerusalem to be near the sources. His translation, the Vulgate, became the official Bible of the Catholic Church for over 1,000 years. Every sermon preached in medieval Western Europe, every theologian who built on the scriptural record, worked from Jerome's Latin. Jerome included the Pericope Adultery. He included it because the Latin manuscripts he was working from, the Western Latin tradition, the tradition based in the churches of Gaul and Spain and North Africa, had been carrying this passage for at least a century before his time. He described his source manuscripts as ancient. He trusted them. But there is a letter Jerome wrote in 417 CE, 34 years after completing the Vulgate. In that letter, he addresses the passage and acknowledges that many manuscripts contained it. Not all, not the oldest, many. It is the kind of careful qualification that, in scholarly writing, signals awareness of a problem. A man who was certain of his evidence does not say many. A man who knows the evidence is not uniform says many, and lets the ambiguity do the work. The man who put the story into the definitive Latin Bible of Western Christianity knew when he included it that the Greek manuscript tradition was not uniform. He made a choice. He followed his Latin sources. And from that choice, 400 years after Jesus died, the verse arrived at the King James Bible, at every English language pulpit, at the Rotary Club lunch, at my lips when I needed an argument. The United Bible Society's scholarly committee placed the Pericope Adultery in double brackets, a notation reserved for passages they are certain are not original to the text, but too deeply embedded in the tradition to delete. They are saying, in the clearest academic language available. We know this was added by a later hand, while still printing it because 17 centuries of tradition have given it a life independent of its origins. Metzger, who chaired the committee for decades and wrote the volume explaining its decisions, described the Pericope Adultery as a most perplexing passage. His explanation of the double bracket rating is unambiguous. The committee's conclusion was unanimous, not a majority, not a strong consensus, unanimous. Every pastor who attended seminary read that text, read those brackets, read Metzger's explanation, then went home to their congregation and said, "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone," and never mentioned the brackets. I need to tell you about my daughter Rachel. She is in her early 40s now, teaches 4th grade, 2 kids of her own, both elementary school age. Still goes to the same church her mother and I took her to when she was small. Same building, same denomination, same pews. She is one of the sharpest people I know. Reads widely, thinks carefully, not someone you can move around easily in an argument. And she has used, "Let him without sin cast the first stone," exactly the way I used to use it. At Thanksgiving dinners when things got heated, in a conversation with her brother-in-law, who takes harder positions on pretty much everything than she does. Once, in a conversation with me when she was defending the institutional church against something I had said about its track record on honesty. It was a Sunday afternoon, about 2 years ago. She had driven up with the grandkids, and after lunch we were sitting on the porch while the kids ran around the backyard. One of those conversations that starts with weather and schools and what someone at church said, and then goes somewhere you didn't plan for. She said, "Dad, people like you always focus on the worst things the institution has done. But Jesus himself was different. He wasn't about condemnation. He wasn't about the law as a weapon. You know the verse." I knew which verse she meant. I didn't say anything for a moment. I was watching my grandkids and thinking about all the times I had stood in that same posture of certainty, the verse in my hand, like something solid. Then I said, "That verse wasn't in any Bible for 400 years. She looked at me the way people look when they think they have heard wrong. I told her, not the whole manuscript trail, not P66, and the Codex Vaticanus, and Jerome's letter, and Metzger's rating system. Just the core. The oldest surviving manuscripts do not contain it. The scholars who study those manuscripts voted unanimously that it was added by a later hand. The critical Greek text that every seminary uses prints it with brackets and a note explaining why." She did not argue. She did not get angry. She went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with being persuaded or not persuaded. It was the quiet of someone sitting with something they cannot unhear, something that has no immediate place to go. After a while she said, "Why would they not tell us that?" I did not have a better answer than the obvious one. The pastors knew. The brackets were in the text. Metzger's explanation was in the companion volume every Greek student reads in their first year. And somewhere between the seminary classroom and the Sunday sermon, across centuries, denominations, languages, continents, a decision was made, not once but 10,000 times, that the congregation did not need to know about the brackets. Rachel picked up her coffee cup. The kids were still in the backyard. She said quietly, "Does it make the point less true? What Jesus was trying to show?" I told her what I actually think. I don't believe it makes Jesus less compassionate. The other Gospels are full of that compassion, documented without any doubtful passages. What it does is make the institution less honest. Those are two different questions, and the church has spent centuries treating them as one. She nodded slowly, the way you nod when you're absorbing something, not agreeing to it. Then she changed the subject to her daughter's school situation. I let her change it. I have been sitting with that porch conversation for 2 years. Here is the thing I keep turning over. The story of the woman in the dust, the sound of stones dropping, the question, where are your accusers? This may be, as Ehrman argues, a genuine echo of how Jesus moved in the world. The other Gospels show that compassion, repeatedly, without any questionable textual history. A healer who touches lepers when no one else would. A rabbi who speaks to Samaritan women in public. A teacher who eats with tax collectors and sinners in ways that made the righteous uncomfortable. The picture of Jesus as someone who stood between the condemned and the stone throwers is coherent with everything else the Gospels record. So why was an insertion needed? If the authentic tradition already established this, why did an anonymous voice in the 5th century feel compelled to write a story and place it into John's Gospel? It may simply capture something true in spirit that the tradition wanted preserved. An oral story circulating because it sounded like Jesus, eventually written down and inserted because the people transmitting it believed it belonged. But there is another thing the pericope Adultery does that I cannot stop noticing. "Let him without sin cast the first stone" is, among other things, an exceptionally convenient verse to have available when you want to shut down criticism of an institution. It is a verse that does not merely demonstrate Jesus' compassion for one woman in a specific moment. It frames any act of condemnation, including the condemnation of an institution by people outside it, as itself a form of self-righteous stone-throwing. Used that way, the verse is not just about mercy, it is about immunizing the powerful from accountability by making the accusation itself into a moral failure. I am not saying that is why someone added it. I am saying that the verse, across 17 centuries of theological argument, has served that immunizing purpose again and again, and that an institution with its own complicated moral record might have found reasons not to look too carefully at whether the verse that protected it was authentic. The silence is not the forgery. The silence is the choice that runs underneath the forgery, that maintained it, that printed the brackets in scholarly editions and left them out of popular ones. That is the pattern. Now let me show you what the Gospel of John actually says in the manuscripts that do not have the insertion, because this is the part that stopped me cold when I first read it, and it is the part almost no one knows. In P66, in P75, in the Codex Sinaiticus, in the Codex Vaticanus, the narrative of John 7 and 8 runs like this. John chapter 7, verse 52. The Pharisees are meeting in closed session. Nicodemus has cautiously suggested they actually listen to Jesus before condemning him. Does our Lord judge a man without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? The Pharisees turn on Nicodemus. Are you from Galilee too? Search and see that no prophet arises from Galilee. That is where the discourse ends in those manuscripts. The Pharisees have dismissed the possibility of a prophet from Galilee. And then, without any break, without any transitional scene, without a woman or a mourning or a temple court or a crowd with rocks, John chapter 8, verse 12. Jesus speaks, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Read that twice. The Pharisees say, no prophet comes from Galilee, meaning, whatever you think Jesus is, the tradition rules it out. The geography alone disqualifies him, and Jesus responds by saying he is the light of the world. That is an argument, not a detour, not a scene from somewhere else in the city inserted into the middle of a theological exchange. The Pharisees assert that his origins disqualify him. He answers that claim with a declaration about his nature. The discourse that follows in John 8, you are from below, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world. Before Abraham was born, I am. You are doing the works of your father. Is a sustained exchange about authority and origin. Where does Jesus come from? What gives him the right to speak as he speaks? When you read John chapter 7 verse 52 moving directly into chapter 8 verse 12, the logic of that argument is clean and internally consistent. The Pharisees raise the question of origin. Galilee. Jesus reframes the question of origin, light and darkness above and below before Abraham. The two positions are in direct dialogue. The chapter is a single coherent argument from beginning to end. With the insertion, the woman appears from nowhere. The scene concludes. She disappears and is never mentioned again, and then Jesus announces, I am the light of the world, floating free of the argument about Galilee, unanchored from the Pharisees' challenge, arriving as a separate declaration rather than an answer to anything. The inserted version is the disrupted one. The original is the coherent one. Spinoza established this in chapter 7 of the Tractatus. Interruptions, shifts in logic, figures who enter and disappear without consequence. These are the signatures of material inserted by someone who was not the original author. The pericope Adultery displays every one of those signatures. The text beneath it, Nicodemus dismissed, then, I am the light of the world without interruption, is more coherent and more consistent with John's theological program than the version every Bible in print contains. The omitted verses are not a gap. They are the original argument. The insertion is the gap. I am not saying Jesus lacked compassion. I want to say that clearly, because I know what people expect from this kind of research. Destroy the story, destroy the claim, prove that the institution's favorite verse about mercy was a lie, and therefore the mercy was a lie. That is not where this goes. The compassion is documented everywhere. Mark, Luke, Matthew. It does not need the pericope Adultery to stand. What I am saying is something more specific, and in some ways more troubling than calling the verse fraudulent. An institution has been aware for at least 2 centuries, since the 19th century textual scholars who first assembled the critical apparatus that became the UBS text, that the most beloved verse in the New Testament for demonstrating the compassion of Jesus was inserted after the gospel was written. Inserted by an anonymous hand, in a tradition the oldest surviving manuscripts do not represent, into a narrative space where an original argument ran without it. The brackets have been in the scholarly edition since the 19th century, The seminaries teach it. The pastor stands up at the pulpit every Sunday and says, "Let him without sin cast the first stone." Spinoza was excommunicated by the Jewish community of Amsterdam in 1656 for suggesting that the Pentateuch was not written by Moses, that it was a composite document assembled from multiple sources by editors who worked centuries after the events it describes. His argument was correct. The community that excommunicated him knew it was probably correct within a century. And the institution that rose from the tradition he was examining has spent 350 years not finding a better answer to his method than silence and erasure. The cherem against Spinoza was the harshest in Amsterdam's documented history. He published the Tractatus 14 years later with no name on it, no city, a false publisher, because the last man who had written something like it in Amsterdam had been found dead in a canal. That is not metaphor. That is the historical record. What Spinoza proposed was a method. Read the document as a document. Follow the evidence produced by the text itself, the internal consistency, the vocabulary patterns, the compositional history visible in the seams. Do not overlay the text with what the tradition needs it to say. Let it say what it says. Applied to the pericope Adultery, that method produces one conclusion. The story of the woman caught in adultery is not from John. It entered from a different tradition, through a different copying stream, and was preserved and maintained by an institution that chose not to tell its congregations what the brackets meant. I still love that story. The woman in the dust, the sound of the oldest dropping his stone first. The question left hanging, where are your accusers? I will probably always love it. It describes something I believe about how Jesus moved in the world, even knowing the text is not his. But I needed to know the truth about it, more than I needed the comfort of not knowing. That is the truth of it. Make of that what you will.